Alrighty, so let's get started. This probably is gonna be a long video, but I'll do whatever I can to explain my whole idea. So for those who doesn't like to put logic, like code logic, into blueprints because performance issues as the code base grows, it's kind of hard to track MRs and pull requests and merge requests into the Git repos because it's kind of hard to actually see the diffs between blueprint files, which are UI assets files, instead of just looking at the code, which is pretty easy to see the diffs and do a proper code review on it. So yeah, those are the main reasons basically why I usually put all as much as I can of code into into C++ instead of blueprints, and that also applies for UI code. So user interface codes basically, I'm gonna show you how I did this UI, basically this inventory UI. So as you can see, there is the whole character moving, like the character preview I showed in some of the previous videos how to put that on, but I'll show you how to put that on with C++, or at least most of that, and how to build the whole structure, like the weapons, gears, clothing, potions, etc. And if you pick it up as well, like an item, like a shield, as you can see, if I go to the shield tab, now I have a shield, and it has like a couple procedures. Like if I mouse over the item, you can see that there is like um, a preview of the status of the item, and if I unhover the item, you can see that it's just gone. So you can set up like a preview on how much that item can actually increase in our character stats or whatever. And if I tap on it, it's not implemented yet, but as you can see, it's now active. But it's not still implemented to update the clothing itself, which is the next step after this one. In the same way, all of those hover effects and etc. Those are all C++ based mostly, at least. So yeah, the same way if there is an item, as you can see that there's like no items and etc. Basically everything is done through C++. The designs are done into blueprints, like not blueprints, but the widget editor. But the whole code behind it is in C++ mostly. So first of all, let me show you what I did. So if you want to create like a UI code, like a user interface code, let me just go back to the UI. I can go to the pause menu. As you can see, there's like a user widget, C++ class over here. So if you can just create a new class, show all classes, and look for a user widget. That's the class you want to use it. It's the same class as if you would go through blueprints, user interface, widget blueprint. It's the same class basically. So what's the difference between doing that way and the other one is that way you can code things into like code the button functionality, like what are the required buttons, what are the required design. You can code basically anything under the hood and just leave the design like, okay, put the button into whatever color you want it, but whatever that button is going to do, it's up to me as a programmer, not much as to the designer, because that's a feature. So what I did basically is if I look up into the class and I not only create the pause menu, but also the whole inventory things like the bottom options of the inventory, the actual inventory slots, and the item info, which is basically that preview of the info, the instructions to pick up the item, which is basically this, you know, basic shield info. And if you change that as well, so those are also using the asset manager at the Unreal Engine. So if you change the item to a sword, for example, you can see that it builds at runtime, and now it's a simple sword to pick it up. And you can do that with clothing as well. So if you pick it up like a clothing one, you can see now it's shoulder pads. So yeah, it's pretty simple. All UI stuff is done through C++ basically. So, but those are all derived from that same class, which is basically the user widget class. So user widget class, which is basically the same. So once you create your class, you can just right button and create blueprint class based on it. Or if that doesn't work properly, to open up the UI as a regular UI, like one of those editors itself, if it opens like a blueprint instead of this way, you can just go to user interface, create like a widget blueprint like regularly, And under the widget blueprint, you can just go to the graph, class settings, and then change to whatever class you created in C++. For example, top options, or I forgot the name of it, like inventories. Like those are all pause menu. Those are all my C++ classes, and I can always change that way. You can see that now it's going to compile with an error, but I'll show you why it's compiling with an error in a few seconds. Because there are a few requirements that I set it up into the C++ class for that class to actually work properly. But yeah, so that way you create your class, but how do I actually bind a couple elements from that class into my, into my functionality itself? For example, if I open the blueprint, I can see that I have a couple slots, I have these no items, I have like my hover. How do I actually bind that into my blueprint class? So first of all, let's start for the basics. Usually what I do is in blueprints, or whatever you want to call it, I just create like user interface widget blueprint and start to prototyping, like to catching up with the design that I wanted. And once I'm happy with it, then I start to do into coding, which is basically decoupling whatever design I wanted into code as much as I can. So I create that design basically first of all into regular widget blueprint, then I start decoupling. So while decoupling, I figured that since I'm gonna have a lot of slots, as you can see that for this I have like 5 slots into the front row. I have under the 5. This one I have 6. I can have up to whatever I wanted. I figured that instead of creating like 14 different buttons in it, I could just create like a simple slot. So this is the first class I created, which is this inventory slot. And this inventory slot, basically, as you can see, it has a couple things in it. And its blueprint class derivative from that class is, let me just go back to inventory, is this WBP underscore slot. And as you can see, there is like a couple items in it, and there's like, it's pretty much without design itself, but uh, if you look at it, what has into this is I have a slot index, because since I'm building that with the uniform grid, I do need to set it up where is the index that I want to look for under my inventory. But the design itself, it needs to have a button, it needs to have an image thumbnail for my item. It may or may not have as well a amount property at the bottom of it. So for example, clothing, I don't want that. Weapons, I don't want that. But potions, I may have lots of potions, so I need to have that information in my slot, since that's going to be like a basic class to follow for all my other designs. So what I do that basically, I create like this class, this variable called slot button, and I set this meta to bind widget. By doing so, I force my whatever class I'm derived from. If I'm deriving my widget blueprint to my C++ class, it's gonna force me to have a button with that exact name. So basically, I grab class U button, slot button. If I have like a button with another name, let me just change to slot button 1, for example. And if I try to compile, it's going to cause an error, because it's saying I require widget binding slot button of type button was not found. So it's not going to compile, because it's saying like I need to have a button with that name. So that's how I force the design to have a button with that name. He can take care of the design, but I need to take care of the feature itself, the functionality behind it. So he can do whatever he wanted on the visuals, but he needs to have that button somewhere. And the same way, I want to have my pickup thumbnail, or my pickup image, or whatever you want to put it. And that in that case is my U image with the name thumbnail. The same way, bind widget. I put blueprint read write in case the designer wants to grab that variable later on. For example, if you wanted to grab like a slot button or something, he can get it. He can set it if he wanted to. If I set to blueprint read only, it's not gonna have a set it, but it's gonna have only the getter. But yeah, so that way I force the design to think about it and make my the item that I wanted to into my class. So that's the first step, and that's the most important one, because if I wanted later on to understand when do I click into the button, where I'm going to use this variable, and if this variable is not there, well, it's not going to do anything. So that's how I bind my requirement into the widget itself. I have a couple other properties, which is not important. It's just because I have like a couple sections into my inventory, which is, as you saw, like the weapons, the shield, or the clothing, or the potion, etc. So I need to understand what is the type of that slot. So in order for me to filter out and know and to with variable later on to look for, if I want to look for potions, etc., based on the tab I'm on. And I have a couple delegates, which basically, if you see a bunch of other tutorials on the internet, you're gonna see that once they create, this is not like a thing that nobody's using. They usually do that, but when they're doing blueprints, what they do usually when they create this lot is they create what they call event dispatchers or something like that for the button. So I don't remember where that is, but I remember there we go, event dispatcher. So usually what they do, they create like something on clicked or whatever, on slot update or whatever you want it to call it, so they can bind to whatever the user clicked. I can later on call a function on the blueprint. So basically, yeah, the event dispatchers, you can basically use it delegates under C++ to call them, while the events of the buttons itself, you can use proper functions to it. You can copy because they are already delegates inside of uh, the native UE4 code, so you can just create a couple of functions and bind to those already existing delegates. However, if you want to create a new event dispatcher, you need to create a custom delegate for yourself. How do I do that? For example, if I want to simulate on clicked on that button, on press, on release, remember I have that variable called slot button. So the only thing I would need to do is I would need to create a function called on slot click, on slot hover, on slot unhovered. I don't want to do whatever I want with on press or to on release. I don't want that, but I want those two. But how do I know that? What are the parameters needed for those functions? You can just go to let me just go to the functions itself. Let me just go open the CPP file. As you can see, I have this function called initialize, which is even before the construct, the construct event of the function itself. Like before this event construct, we have this initialize to initialize the whole thing. And I before even trying to do anything, I I'm trying to be sure that a couple elements, like key elements, are still present into the overall UI. If those are not present, the editor is probably pretty much going to crash. So if I don't have a slot button, or if I don't have thumbnail set under the actual blueprint class, they're going to crash. And for my slot button, which is basically U button, you can go back to the slot button. You can open up the U button definition. You're going to find somewhere the unclicked, those events over there. So unclicked, there we go. Those are all the delegates that are for those buttons over here. So on click, on press, on release, on hover, on hover, as you can see, they're all here. So to tag your uh, code into C++, you need to understand first of all which one you want it, and based on what you want it, you want to go to the definition of that delegate so you can see if there is any parameters to it. In that case, there is no parameters, so it's just a void function. But if it was like a different delegate, let's suppose I will go to this delegate, and on the top of it, you see that I would need to have at least two variables into that function, one with that type and the other with the other type, in order to bind something to that delegate. Since those are all empty ones, a void function will do the trick. And how do I actually bind those? Well, under the CVV file on the initialize, you can just do whatever the variable. I mean, they're making sure that those are exists, and if they exist, it's not going to crash. So it's what's basically going to do is bind that delegate to a function, which is basically whatever onClick happen, call onSlotClick function inside of my class over here. Whatever unhover do happen, call onSlotHover, and whatever on unhover happen, call this function. And under those functions, I do whatever I wanted. I set style, I set whatever I wanted. So I do whatever I want to do. So that's how you would bind on click, on hover, those kind of things under C++. So that's one thing. So for example, let me just go back to slot clicked. So as you can see, whenever I click on the slot, what's gonna do? It's gonna call this function set active style. And what that function is pretty much doing is creating a button style, which is basically like creating this thing over here at the top of it. So this appearance, like that's variable, this style variable, it's creating like all of these colors and etc. And it's creating like the normal, the hover, the pressed. It's pretty much setting up everything that you can manually set it over here. And then what's doing is, well, then set it up this style only if I have a thumbnail attached to it. And that's because mainly if I don't have anything into my inventory, I don't want to leave the inventory like as active this lot. So if I have an item to pick it up and to equip, then I want to leave that as an active one, which is basically leave that into a different color so it's active. The same one, it's happening from the hover. If I have, you know, a thumbnail attached to it, I'm gonna broadcast an event dispatcher, which is different from this one. So on the unhovered, I create my own event dispatcher, and what that's doing basically is, let me just open up this. So the event dispatcher, differently from the delegates that I already have, I can create my own. So what I did basically is I create this event dispatcher called onslaught hovered, and what that's passing to me is, well, that's the type of the item I'm looking at, and that's the index to look for into the inventory. So what I'm doing is, well, I'm broadcasting that delegate to whatever thing is listening to me. So if I have another class that is it's using this inventory slot, if he can bind in the same way that I did here a function in the same way that I did this dynamic binding into my slot button, he can do this dynamic binding into my onslaught hover, which would be this unhover event. So yeah, while it's loading, basically what I did then is I bind the delegates that those elements already have into functions. But I have my own functions or my own delegates, which are my event dispatchers. Since I'm gonna build this inventory dynamically, I don't know how much slots I'm gonna need. I don't know um, what is the section I'm at. So I need to specify that somewhere so I can present the preview of those items when I'm hover over a slot. But how do I know which is the item to look for under the inventory? How do I know that? That's why I need those event dispatchers under the blueprints. But what I do in C++ is I create my own event delegates, and then I do the same thing, but under the sorry, there we go. I broadcast that those delegates to somewhere else, to someone that is listening to it. So let me just compile real quick. But what those inventory is doing basically is, well, grabs whatever is my character player, see if it has a inventory component, and well, let me just go to constructor because it's a lot simpler to see it. There we go. So on the constructor script, what I do then, at the beginning, whenever I'm opening the inventory slot, I'm under the weapons tab, and I set the text for that tab basically to weapons, and then I set the weapon button to the active style. So let me just open up. Oops, it's complaining about something. Let me just restore. All right, go ahead. All right, let me just open up. So basically what this does is, whenever I'm hovering this item, it's going to call that function on hover. It has a delegate that is broadcasting to whatever is using those slots. And the one that is using the slots is the actual inventory, which right now doesn't have any, but as it's dynamic, it's gonna build up and use those slots and attach to these slot grid, which is the uniform grid panel. The first, and it's always open before, like in the first place, to weapons because it's the first tab. Then the user can go to the other ones. So that's why I set it up that way. So the first time, set it up to weapons, text, and the structure, and the weapons is going to be the active one. So it's going to be a bit orange on the first opening. As you can see, it's already orange over here. But if I go to the other one, you can see that the other ones becomes orange, but it opens as weapons at the beginning of it. So I'm setting the text of that text over here to weapons as I'm launching it, And then what I do then is I call this function called get inventory items. And this function itself, as you can see, it kind of grabs whatever is the current, uh, what is my current tab. Initially, it's going to be weapons, so it's going to go to this path. But if it's like def weapons, which is basically shoes and etc., or if I'm using clothing or anything else, like which would be potion in that sense. So I grab the amount of slots I'm going to need for, which is basically the amount of slots, the amount of items I have inside of the component array, which is this array over here. Let me just open my character over here, playable character. So as you can see, I have my character and I have an inventory component attached to it, and I have my weapon inventory, my gears inventory, my clothing inventory, and my potion inventory. Each one has at least 5, but the clothing has 6 because it's needed at least 6 slots to fill up, to fully dress my character. The crafting items right now doesn't have any, which is not necessary right now since I'm not using the crafting items so far. But right now I have those. So depending on which is the section of the inventory I'm at, it's going to look for one of those variables and grabbing whatever the amount of slots I need for. And it's going to build the slots based on those variables as well. So what I'm doing then is I'm called this build slots, which is doing basically grab whatever my slot grid is. And remember, all of those are bind widgets as well. So they are required to be into my class, my user blueprint class. So if you open the inventory and in class settings, you can see that the parent class is the inventory, which is my inventory C++ class. And all the items I'm talking about, they are somewhere around here. The designer can add a couple extra items in it, but they need to add whatever I set it then to add. So they need a button to change to the weapons tab. They need a button to change to the armor tab, the potion tab, and etc. They need a grid that needs to be called slots grid. So that's what I'm doing. So basically what I do is clear all the children. So remove all the slots that I have before even do anything. And if the slots that I need is bigger than 0, which means that I have at least one item into these variables over here, what's going to do then is going to set to false that found something, because right now the inventories are empty. So they have elements, but they are all empty. So what they're going to do is, those are logic, like what is the row to put under the slot grid and what's the column to put at the item. Basically what I do is I do a for loop uh, into those, and I do this math to only do like 5 slots per line, which is basically calculate whatever the index is. If it's module of 5, then whatever, do just go to the next line. If for example 5 module to 1 5 module to y would be 0, and then 10 it's module to 5, so it's going to be 0 as well. And 15 it's going to be module to 5, it would be to 0. So we would go to the row 1, 2, 3, or whatever. The column would be resetted to 0 because since it's going to the next row, it's going to need to start from scratch. So it's going to 1, 2, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, go to the next line. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, go to the next line because then it's module, and then reset it to the column 0, and there we go. That's how you would build it. And then if I found something, well, just fill it up. If I don't found something, well, keep trying to find something. What this doing is basically, if it has an item, set that to true. If it doesn't have an item, just keep doing it. It's a weird logic, but that's how I found it out to work. This set slot info, and as soon as that's finished, count column to increment column, so it goes to column 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the row is going to be module to 5, so go to the next row, column 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, go to the next line, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's how you would do it. And if it doesn't found anything, which means like the inventory is there, the slots are there, but they're empty, well, then set that no items visibility to visible. With those no item visibility is pretty much this no items border, which is this no items with the sad face. But if it doesn't find anything, let's go to the set slot info. What that's doing is then, well, create the slot. So create that whatever slot that is, and that's the U inventory slot. So remember that's our WBP slots over there. And what it's doing now, it's loading a bunch of data asset things. This is the asset manager, which is I'm not gonna cover right now. But basically, I'm just creating a slot, grabbing whatever I need, like whatever I need from my inventory asset or my inventory item. Like what is the thumbnail, what is the item name, what is the item type, and I'm setting those basically under the slot properties as I need to. So for example, I set my thumbnail to whatever I wanted. I set my type to whatever my item type is. I set my text to only potions. So only potions are going to present that amount text present, like the amount 1, 2, 3, because I'm not going to have multiple clothing of the same type. I'm not going to allow that in the game. Only potions, I'm going to allow it. So if I have multiple potions of the same type, I'm just going to increment that number into the slot, and I'm going to make that visible as well. And if it's not a potion, I'm going to hide that slot information over here, which is basically this one, this section over here. And well, if it found something, that means it's through this. So I don't need to hide. I don't need to visualize that no with items border, which is this one. So basically, what I do is, if I found something, well, set that to hidden because there is something. So I don't need to present like something no items found. Set the variable to true, and then I just return my found something. So if I found something, I'm gonna find something. I'm gonna create a slot and find that slot. So yeah, just go back to whatever that was, and I'm gonna keep doing that until my amount of slots are empty. So if I have 5 items, that's gonna do until 5. If I have 10 items into the inventory, that's gonna do into 10, and that's visible here. I can actually do that. So let me just increment this to 10 items, for example, under the weapons array. As you can see, if I play it and I open the inventory right now, I have now 10 slots. And if I create, let me just remove everything from here and I hit play, I don't have anything anymore. But if I go to the inventory and create, I don't know, 7 items, you can see that now I have 7 items under the weapons, and the other ones only have 5, 6, and in the same way that I set up. So this is pretty modular and allows the level designer to play around or even create a couple features like, I don't know, if the character do a certain amount of missions, or if it do something specific in the game, he can release another extra inventory slot as a reward for that mission to be accomplished. So yeah, that was the idea behind this. And after this, I broadcast another update slot, which is from this other class. So I create also a delegate for here. But remember, I haven't called yet this unhover delegate. I'm gonna do that eventually. And if I click on weapons, I'm gonna update that to the weapon inventory. If I click on shoot, I'm gonna update that to whatever the shoot inventory is, and etc., etc., etc. And again, the buttons as well have their own functions. All right, so yeah, that's how I basically set it up, this whole thing to work. So that's how I set it up the inventory, that's how I set it up the slot. But right now, I'm just calling those delegates, but no one else is listening to them. So as you saw on the inventory slot, I broadcast my unhovered. I also broadcast my own unhover, because I want to hide that information as soon as just unhover, which is basically this one. So if I pick up an item, if I hover over it, it's going to show my shoulder pads information, but if I unhover it, it's going to hide it. So that's the intention of those delegates over there. And under my menu, my inventory, I also create a delegate to it, and the delegate is called update those slots. And those update slot would also be an event dispatcher eventually. But what I did basically is I called those updates as soon as I finished building those slots. Let me just go open build slots. There we go. So as soon as I finished building the slots that I wanted, so as soon as I finished this for loop over here, I broadcast a message saying I am finished building the slots. But in the same way that as soon as I finish building each inventory slot, I broadcast a message saying like I finished setting up whatever hover and unhover events are and what they're gonna do. But who will actually listen to those two events? Well, as you can see, I have my inventory slot, I have my inventory, but my pause menu has a lot of other things. I have this top menu over here. I have my inventory. I have my character preview, which is not anywhere else. So what I did, I create another blueprint that's gonna kind of sketch all this thing up to sketch everything together, like stick everything together. So in that blueprint is my pause menu. So if I go to the character main, I have this pause menu, and this pause menu in the same way has other blueprints as well into it. So I have a pause menu CPP class over here. Let me just open this uh, his header file. So the pause menu basically is a conglomerate of all the widgets that I wanted to be inside of it. And as you can see, I have this top menu, which is also a C++ class called top options, and it has a couple buttons attached to it. Their delegates are also pretty much set up, and their setup is basically like those default style and texture and opacity and etc. as I pretty much showed before. And the same way as the spot and legend, which is basically, it's still not programmed, it's just like a C++ class, but it's not still programmed to auto detect the keyboard or the gamepad still, but it will do in the future. So I kind of need that to be in C++ as well. And then also these button legend, button options over here, which is basically a class with only the initializer. Oops, not the user widget. And there's bind options over here. And all of those, if you go to the main character, they also have like this is the class that is this button options. This is the class with the top options with the buttons in it. And as you can see, it also derives from the top options. And as you can see, those styles are not set up here. They are set up under the C++ class top options. So if I let me close it up this and open up the top options, as you can see, all the styles are set up under the C++. And this pause menu, on the other hand, is a conglomerate, as I mentioned, with all of those informations in it. So I have my blur effect, which is basically a background blur. As you can see, if I play it and open the inventory, the background's kind of blurry. So that's the blur effect. I have my top option menus, which is basically my top option class called top menu. I had to have a U inventory class called U inventory, and the U inventory is going to have lots of U slots, U inventory slots. I have my character image preview. I have my item info, which is basically that class over here with the item info, which is also an inventory class with basically all the basic information that I needed, and nothing is still set it up to it. But let me just open up the item info. As you can see, there it has a couple things like set element text and the initializer. There's nothing in it. But the pause menu has all of that. And I bind the information over here this way. So I force then to add a class UItemInfo with the name UItemInfo. I force then to add a UImage with the bind widget with the name character preview. In the same way the inventory, in the same way the top menu, and etc. And they can do that by just going to the user created, and they can find whatever they created, the level designer created for those sorts of UI elements. So the inventory is here, so he just kind of drag up here in called inventory. Top menu is also like here, top options. He just kind of drag it up and name top menu. So that's the way you would do it. And on the initializer, I also make sure that, let me just open the top menu, make sure that all the elements are present. And on the construct though, I am listening to my inventory, which means like if my inventory is valid, I'm gonna update the slots for sure because I'm gonna force to update the slot at least once, and I'm listening to my event unupdate slots in the same way that I was listening to unclicked, unhovered, or anything of the sort. So in this sense, my inventory, whenever I'm broadcasting this event, it's going to call under whatever is listening. In this case, my pause menu class is going to listen and it's going to bind to this function update slots. So to give like a visibility on how that would work and what would be the similar approach to blueprints, whenever you're doing like an inventory slot, for example, whenever you're doing this add dynamic unclicked is the same thing as if you were doing something like this. So on blueprint, so it's a lot simpler. So if you click unclicked, there we go. That would bind. That's the same thing as doing this. And whatever you do after this is whatever you put under the unclick. That's the equivalent on C++. On the other hand, if you want to do something like, let me just go back to inventory. You want to update slots, for example, and you create an event dispatcher called, I don't know, update slots. Oops, that should be here. Actually, that's just a test, like a prototype I did, but it would be the same thing as you do something like this, call. So somewhere in a couple tutorials out there may have this approach into blueprints. And if you go to the pause menu and you grab whatever is your inventory, get inventory, let me just go construct. Where is the event construct? Oh, there we go. So bind to update slots. So that would be the same thing. So you would create like something like a custom event, update slots, and you would do something like this. So this and this would be the same as, where is it? There we go. This, calling a broadcast as, and then under whatever you want to do, this and this is pretty much this. And this here would be the same as this over here. So you would grab your custom delegate and add a dynamic to add update slots. Whatever happens after this, it's after this. It's the same thing. So we just need to build this. So that's how you will build your inventory or your whole logic into C++ and not needing blueprint whatsoever. So in this case, what I do in the update slots is I grab whatever is my grid, and if it's valid, what I do is I get all the childrens that I wanted to, and remember, this is listening to my onUpdate. But remember, on my slot, I already broadcast a couple events called unhovered and unhovered. So what I do on the pause menu, not only I listen to this onUpdate slot event, which is the before one, but I grab all my slots and I also start to listen to the unhover and to the hover events. So that way I can present my item preview and I can hide my item preview in the same way. So in that sense, basically what I do is whenever I bind this update slot to update slots, my update slots is also going to bind and start to listen to whatever my slots is broadcasting, which is also a couple custom delegates that I want to have it. And those delegates have useful information. And remember, those delegates inside of my slot, one of them has two parameters, which is this onSlot hovered. So that means that the function that I'm going to call called onItemPreview for the hovered, just open up, needs to have the same parameters as my declaration of the delegate. So I can grab the same parameters the same way that if I create something like this on the inventory, I can create like an event dispatcher called, I don't know, let me just rename that to whatever. And I can create a couple inputs to it, like a boolean, like test or whatever. So on construct, I can call this with a parameter. And if I go to the pause menu and do the same thing again as I did before, let me just go back to the construct. And I can get my inventory, bind, whatever. Oops. Oh, I think it's called an update the lots yet. Yeah, it's binding an update slot. Yeah, it's not calling whatever yet. Yeah, that kind of sucks. But whatever. Yeah, it's not binding yet. Somehow the hot reload's not working. But if I bind that function somewhere else, my custom event, we need to have also this parameter over here on the blueprints. The hot reload is just terrible. But on this way, what I did is my declaration is to have the same parameters as my delegates. So this way, under my pause menu, under the function on item preview, so whenever I hover my slot, I'm gonna broadcast this information on the unhover here, which is grabbing the slot type that I am, and I'm grabbing the slot item, the slot index. That is allowing me to grab that information here and grabbing the component of the inventory component over here, and understanding if I am a weapon, I'm a gear, or a clothing based on the type that is inventory slot S. And based on the type, I am setting the preview information to whatever the type of item is. So if it's weapon, set to whatever weapon data set is. If it's a gear or a shield or whatever, set whatever information of that gear. If it's a clothing, set the whatever clothing information. If it's a potion, set whatever potion information is. And whenever I am also broadcasting the unhover, since that unhover doesn't have any parameters when I declared, the unhover only is hiding this uh, item info on the pause menu, and the item info pretty much, let me just remove this from here because that's not necessary anymore. On the pause menu, this item info, nothing is but this information over here. So once I hover, if there is a valid item to it, show this up, fill this info with the information that I need. And if I'm unhovering that information from the slot, all right, just hide that information because I don't need that anymore. So that's allowing me to do something like this. If it's not a valid item, it's not showing anything, it's presenting no items. If it's a valid item, it's just when I hover over to it, it's going to show me the shoulder pads information. The character information is pretty much as I showed before, so it's just a simple image. There's a video, I think it's video 5 or something, so it's just a brush information based on the material, but I also specify that information under my C++ with a bind information to it. But yeah, and the same way, whenever you wanted to create a couple events like construct event, event construct, pre-construct, destruct, etc. Like there's a lot of events, native events from the user widget. All right, that's also fine to do under C++. So you only need to do is, on this case, this is the destruct, this is the construct. But if you go to the public user widget class, you can see that, let me just find like native construct. You can see that all of them are here, like on initialize, on construct, on pre-construct, on construct, native destruct, tick, paint, all of those events that are virtual. This is deprecated, but all of those virtual events, you can always just copy whatever is on the definition as it is, put an override in front of it, create a definition, and just remember and keep in mind, remember to call the super native before doing anything else. So in this case, whenever I'm destructing I'm removing the widget from the parent, I'm just removing the dynamic. I'm stopping listening to that delegate because otherwise it's just going to cause me some weird issues on the waveform. So when I'm compiling and I'm constructing the event, I am listening to the delegate. Whenever I'm destructing or removing that widget, I'm stopped listening to both delegates on my update slots and also my hover and unhovered slot info. And that should be about it. That's how you build a custom widget into C++. I know it's a lot of things to keep in mind, but to summer the whole thing up, whenever you need an item to be a requirement, like a thing that needs to be in the UI, create that information as a bind widget with the proper class in it, give it the name, and the class is not going to compile if that name with the same class is not present into the user widget. One thing. Second thing, if you need a couple events from the blueprints like this one, just keep in mind to look for those events. And if they're virtual under the actual user widget, you can always override that info under your header file, create a definition, call the super and do whatever you wanted to it. Like, so you could do that easily on C++. Third thing is if you have a couple buttons or a couple elements that you want to interact with in the way that usually Blueprint would work. For example, if you have a button, let me just go back and find a button over here, that one. If you have a button that you want to interact with the onClick event or the onPress or onRelease, they're all delegates. So you can always go to the inventory slot, and you can always go to, on this case, you can always go to the uButton class, clicked on it, look for whatever you wanted to, like onClicked. You're gonna find the delegates for it, for each one of those. You can always click on it and copy the definition. In this case, there's no parameters, but if there was parameters, you would see something similar to this one. So if there is parameters, you need to create a function with the same parameters, the same classes, and etc. But if there isn't, you can always just create like a void function with nothing in it. And on your initialize function of your widget, so this initialize function over here, you can always bind those events to it. So whenever you call that function on slot clicked, it's the same thing as clicked over here. And the fourth option is whenever you need to create event dispatchers, then you need to create your own custom delegates, which is basically, well, just create that one, declare dynamic multicast delegate. And if you want 2 parameters on it, 2 params. If you don't want any parameters on it, and just keep in mind to give a name, like a type to it, like a variable type to it, and all the inputs for that function. And under your header file, you need to use that, to declare those somewhere in it. I call unhovered, I call on unhovered, and you need to broadcast those informations out there so you could pick it up that delegate somewhere else and bind that event to it. So that case, I always broadcast that information on the hover event. I broadcast whenever I hover it, and the unhovered I broadcast whenever I unhover the buttons. And whenever I need to grab that element, I can always grab, in this case I grab on the pause menu. I can do the same as if it was like a regular event click, which is just grabbing whatever I needed to, grab the variable. And in this case I'm removing that, but I added that information somewhere here. There we go. So in that case, add dynamic, etc. And the fifth and last thing to remember is whenever you're destructing your widgets, keep in mind to remove the delegates, all your delegates. If you create a custom delegate, keep in mind to remove that, because if you don't remove it, it's not gonna crash the editor right now, but probably gonna have issues with cooking later on, or your final game may crash because they may try to uh, listen to a delegate that is not available anymore, not available in memory anymore because the ID have been destroyed already. So keep in mind to whenever you add a dynamic or you add a function to a delegate, you need to manage that and remove that delegate whenever you're not using it anymore. So in that case would be whenever I'm not destructing the widget, I'm removing the delegates as well. And that should be about it. Hope you like it. See you.